Let's install Arch Linux with full disk encryption. So for this tutorial, I'm assuming that you've downloaded the ISO from the archlinux.org website, you've verified that ISO image, and you've copied it to a USB drive using DD or Rufus or something like that. And you've then put it in your machine and you've booted via that USB to this prompt here. So the first thing we're going to do is align our key map setting with the specific keyboard we're using. So if you're in the US, you don't need to worry about this, it's already set to default in Arch. But if you're in the UK like me, then you're going to need to load keys space UK. And now I can use all my keys. If you're somewhere else, then you can run this command and this will show you a list of all the key maps available to you. If you want to be a bit more specific, you can grep this output. So for me, I'd put grep space UK, and that's going to show me all the UK maps. Say if I was in France, for example, I could do the same thing. Okay, so now let's check that we can boot using BIOS as opposed to UEFI. So the way to do that is to list this directory, sys firmware, and then start typing EFI and tab. And if you get any matches, then you're probably using UEFI and you need to go back into your BIOS, like reboot your machine, press enter or delete or whatever your motherboard manual tells you to do, and then make sure you've got legacy or BIOS ticked in there, and then come back to this position. Otherwise, you're running BIOS and we're fine. Now let's get our network connectivity sorted out. If you've got a LAN cable, plug it in, you'll be fine, you'll be connected to the web. If you don't and you're using your Wi-Fi, then you can use IWCTL to sort this out. So IWCTL is an interactive tool, so if you type this, press enter, you're going to have a little green command prompt come up. And then you want to pick your device, so you can type device list, press return, and that's going to give you a list of all your devices. So pick the Wi-Fi card from there, and then you're going to type in station, a space, whichever device you got from the previous command, and then scan. And that's going to do a Wi-Fi scan for any SSIDs. And then you want station, get networks, and that's going to print a list of all the networks available to you. And then station, whichever device, connect, and then whichever SSID you have, whatever your Wi-Fi name is that you would usually connect to. It's going to connect to the web. You'll need to put your password in, and then you'll be connected to the web. Now let's set our system clock. So we want time, date, CTL, set NTP to be true. And you can check that with time, date, CTL status if you like. Okay, now let's partition our disk. So we'll use cfdisk because it's really easy. And we want DOS because we're going to be using the master boot record for grub. And this is our free space. And you can just see this is our 8GB drive that we're on. So we're going to make 3 partitions. A boot partition, which is going to have grub, and a swap partition, and a root partition, which will be encrypted. So let's make our boot partition first. So we go to new, and let's make it 400 megs to accommodate grub. It's primary, and it's also bootable. Let's move to our free space again. Let's create a new partition, and this is for swap, so let's just make it 1 gig. You could make this however large you wanted. It's primary again, and the type this time is not Linux. The type is Linux swap. Okay, then let's make our root partition. So this is going to have the rest of our system on it. New, and we can leave the default here because it's just going to fill the drive. It's primary again, and it's Linux. So there's all our partitions made. So let's write that to the drive. Yes. And now when we quit, we can list block, and there you see we've got our partitions. This is our drive STA, and we've got the 400 boot partition, the 1GB swap, and the 6.6GB root partition. Now let's format these partitions. So our first one SDA1, this is our boot partition, and this needs to be ext4, and then we give it the drive path. So this is make file system ext4, and this is the partition we're going to format. And there we go. Let's list block again. And now let's make our second partition the swap partition. So that's this one here, the 1 GB one. So we say make swap /dev/sda2. And now let's turn that swap space on with swap on and give it the drive again. Okay. Now that you can see our swap is on. Now let's encrypt our final partition, SDA3, our root partition. So we're going to use crypt setup and looks format, because we're using the Linux encryption system. And let's make the command verbose so we get a bit more information on its output. And we'll make the size of the key 512 bits, and we'll use a SHA-512 hash for that, and then we'll feed it our location for the drive we want to make the Lux container on. Yes, that's okay. And now we need to feed it our passphrase. Make this a nice long passphrase. And there we go. We now have a container on our drive. And now we need to format that. So let's list our block devices again. Nothing seems to have changed, but we actually do have a container here. So let's open this container. So we'll use crypt setup again. And this time we'll open the container. We'll give it the location, oops, like that. And we'll give it the name that we want to map this container to. So I'm going to call it crypt disk, but you could put whatever you liked here. Now let's feed it the passphrase we just gave it. And there we go. Now we can see we have our crypt disk, which is the name you fed it in that last command. Now let's format this partition. So we want this to be ext4 again, and this time what Lux does is it maps that encrypted container to this mapper location here. So if we type in the name we gave it, crypt disk, this is actually the location of our encrypted partition. So now we've formatted that, and that's our drive partitioned and formatted with the encryption container made, ready for us to start mounting the drives. So now we've got our partitions, we're all set to mount them so we can start installing Arch Linux. So let's mount our root partition. Now our root partition is this one here. So we mount dev mapper crypt disk, which is this name here, and let's mount it to the root in mount. Okay, now when we list block, you can see that it's mounted there. And now let's mount our boot partition. So we first need to create that mount point. So let's make directory in mount called boot, and let's mount our boot partition to mount boot. Let's clear the screen. You can now see those mounted partitions. Wonderful. That's all our partitions mounted, and we're ready to install the base Arch Linux system before we run a few more commands and then actually go into the install itself. So we will use packstrap to install onto mount, which is where our root is, and we'll install the base package, the Linux package, and the Linux firmware package, and also a text editor. So I'm just going to use nano, but you could use whatever you liked. So run that command and install those packages. Right, assuming that command ran, we now have our base install of Arch Linux, and we need to do a couple of little admin things before we actually go into the install itself. So first we need to generate the fstab file using the UUIDs. So this is just so that systemd knows what our drives are called, where they are, so that it can mount them when we boot up. So let's just put that into etc fstab. Perfect. And now we can check that by catting it out. So let's just cat that file that we just appended. And there we go. There's our 3 drives. Our crypt disk in root, our SDA1, which is our boot drive, and our SDA2, which is our swap. Perfect. Now let's exit the installer and go into the actual install itself. So we arch to root into mount. Lovely. Now we're inside our base Arch Linux installation, and the first thing we need to do is set our local time. So to do this, we're going to make a symbolic link and force it, and we're going to link user share zone info, and then wherever you are. So I'm in Europe, so you could actually tab this to see all our options depending on your location. I'm in Europe and then London, and we're going to symbolic link that to etc local time. Fantastic. Now let's sync our hardware clock to our system clock. So we want HW clock tag sys to hardware clock. Wonderful. Now we're going to set our locale. So let's use our text editor nano, and we're going to edit the locale.gen file, and we're going to scroll down to, well, whatever your locale is. So mine is EN GB, and you uncomment the line you want, save and quit. And now we need to generate those locales. So now we've uncommented it, we can run locale gen, and that's going to generate however many locales we want. And now let's configure locale.conf. So again, open with a text editor, we want etc locale.conf, and we just need to put in whatever it was that we chose before. So again, for me it's lang equals en underscore gb dot utf-8, but this will change depending on the options you chose when you generated your locale before. Save and quit. Because we have a different keyboard to a US keyboard, we need to make sure that our load keys that we did before is persistent across this machine that we've just created. So to do that, we need to use our text editor again, and we're going to edit the vconsole.conf. And in here, again, we need to put our key map. So it's key map equals, and then whatever your key map was when you first loaded your live USB. Save and quit. Perfect. And now we need to give our machine a host name. So again, let's go use nano for that, and we just edit the hostname file in etc, and we give it whatever we want to call it. So I'm going to call it run Linux. Save and quit. Now it's time to edit our etc hosts file for our networking. So again, let's nano into the file etc/hosts, and this file has a very specific formatting need. So just to follow what I'm putting here, so 127.0.0.1 tab localhost, next line 2 colons 1 double tab localhost 127.0.1.1 tab across, then your host name. So for me it's run Linux dot local domain, then another tab, and then your host name again. Fantastic. Save and quit. Next, a little bit of user admin. So let's give a password to our root user. So passwd, type in the password. type in again. Great, so now it's time to install some packages. So pacman tag capital S, and we want our bootloader grub. We want network manager for networking, along with wireless tools and WPA supplicant. A couple of file system stuff. So we want mtools and DOS FS tools. You don't need this, but if you're going to be using different disk systems, then you might like them. Base, devel, if you're going to be doing any compiling software, and the Linux headers. If you want the suckler stuff, you'll need these two packages as well. And then I like to throw in mandb, the man pages and text info, because I like to use the manuals a lot, so it's nice to have them there. Press enter on that, run that command, install those packages. Okay, now it's time to configure grub, our bootloader. So let's edit the text file, etc default grub, and we need to add our crypt device to this grub command Linux line here. So we want crypt device is equal to, and then the name of our partition, so the one that we did was SDA3, then a colon, and then the name of the container that we made. So that's crypt device equals, that's the partition, colon, and then the name that we gave to the mapper. Let's save and quit. And because we've used encryption, we now need to rebuild the RAM disk, the initial RAM disk, with MK init CPIO. If you didn't use encryption, you wouldn't need to do this, but let's go into our config file, which is etc/mkinitcpio.conf, and we're going to go right down to the hooks here, so the one that is uncommented, which is down here, and just in between block and file systems, all we need to do is add encrypt. Then we need to just save and quit. Perfect. And now let's regenerate that with mk init cpio tag p Linux. Excellent. Let's install grub. Now we've configured it, so grub install tag target equals i386 -PC, and it doesn't matter if you're running a 64-bit processor, this is still the same command. And then we give it the actual name of the drive, not the partition, the whole drive. So it's grub install tag target equals i386 -PC, and then the name of the drive, not the partition. Excellent. Let's clear the screen, and now let's generate the grub config file. So we want grub mk config space tag o boot grub.cfg. A little bit of user admin, so let's add our initial user and give them sudo powers. So we want user add tag m tag capital G, then in Arch you need to be part of the wheel group, and then a username. Perfect. And now let's change the password for the user, so password and then the name of the user. Fantastic. And now let's give that user sudo powers. So usually you type in vi sudo here, but let's use a different editor, so let's give it, let's make the environment variable editor equal to vim and vi sudo. You could use nano or whatever you wanted in here. And now we're going to scroll down to the wheel all. Here we go. And we just want to uncomment that one here. Save and quit. Perfect. And now let's enable our network manager so that we can have Wi-Fi when we reboot our system. So let's use systemd for that. enable our network manager service. And that means that, so enable just means that when we reboot, it will always be running. Wonderful. So now we can exit the installation. So with just exit. So this is going back to our live USB from the system we've just installed. And let's list our partitions just to see. So now we want to unmount all of these, so we can just give it a umount all for unmount all. Some of those aren't going to work because they're being used, but that's okay. So when we reboot, we will come back and the computer will ask us for our passphrase for our encrypted disks, and we'll type those in, and we'll come back to this command prompt again, and we'll be able to log in as the user we created with the password we gave it.